In the Maine legislature, when people appear to support or oppose a piece of legislation, particularly to support legislation, the question always is, why are you here? What's the problem? And I think almost everyone in this room knows what the problem is, and we don't have to go into a long recitation. I carry in my pocket a little card that has on it basically two facts, two graphs. The card is entitled Climate Change in a Nutshell. On one side of the card is CO2 over the last million years. And it basically shows that for the first 900 plus thousand years, CO2 bounced around in the atmosphere between 180 and 250 or so parts per million. People will say CO2 changes in nature, and it does, but that was the band. And then in about 1860, the graph changes dramatically and is on a steady upward trend. And as you all know, in the past year, it's reached 400 parts per million, the highest level it's been in 3 million years. And that graph tells you two things. One, something's happening. Something very significant is happening in terms of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The second thing it tells you is that people have something to do with it, because the graph starts to inflect upwards dramatically at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the time that we started burning fossil fuels in large quantities. So that's part one. The other side of the graph talks about the relationship historically over a million years between CO2 and temperature. And it lays the two over each other, and indeed, it's an exact correlation. CO2 goes up, temperature goes up. CO2 goes down, temperature goes down. This has been going on, we know, for a million years and probably for a lot longer. CO2 is now at a much higher level than it's been, as I mentioned, in 3 million years, and the temperature is inevitably going to catch up. And for the life of me, I don't understand why this is a partisan, political, controversial issue. This is simply science. Nobody is going to the floor of the United States Senate and trying to repeal the fact that light travels at 186,000 miles per second. The correlation between CO2 and temperature is well established. It's just data. And so the question is something happening is absolutely true. What are the effects? We're all going to talk about those, and everybody, I can talk about lobsters moving north, the decline of the moose population, changes in the composition of our forest. But there was an article this weekend that really sent a chill through me. That I think, because all the things we're talking about are incremental changes, changes that occur over a long period of time and are somewhat gradual. I have people in Maine saying, what's wrong if we have North Carolina's climate? But the article in the paper over the weekend talked about potential effects on ocean currents and the effect of the dumping of a great deal of fresh water from the Greenland and Arctic ice caps into the ocean and what that could do to the Gulf Stream and other ocean currents that are a very complex system. And if you look at the map, without the Gulf Stream, Scandinavia and Northern Europe are uninhabitable. It would be a huge change. And the final point I want to make is that these changes, we all tend to think of them as happening in long-term geologic time. The last ice age started in a matter of decades. The thing that shocked me when I was at the climate change lab at the University of Maine at Orono was the term abrupt. And that if you look at the history of changes in the world's climate, they don't happen 1 degree every 150 years. A switch is turned. And we're in danger of a tipping point where that switch is turned. And if indeed there's an effect on the ocean currents, we're not talking about incremental changes and lobsters being in New Brunswick rather than Maine. We're talking about catastrophic changes, because we all think of England as being to our east. If you take a globe, England is way north of us. England is on the same latitude as Hudson's Bay. It's only the Gulf Stream that makes Northern Europe, Scandinavia, habitable. And so we're talking about potentially catastrophic changes. The question really before us is whether it's too late, and I happen to believe that it isn't, and that we still have opportunities to make a difference. And that gets us to the Clean Power Plan. Will it totally solve the problem? Of course not. But the only way to tackle a problem like this is in bite-sized chunks, and this is a very important step. I like it because I happen to be somewhat conservative about regulation and the ability of Washington to define regulation that will fit every area of the country and be appropriate. We've seen too many examples where that isn't the case. No Child Left Behind, which we just effectively repealed, was an example of Washington having a one-size-fits-all program that really didn't work across the country. So the thing I like about the Clean Power Plan is that it effectively says, here's our goal, here's where we want to get, but the states and the industries in those states have to figure out how to get there. And I think that's a much better approach than Washington trying to decide the technology of how to get there, but leave that to the states and the industries in those states. So I think that is a very important, somewhat overlooked characteristic of this plan and how it has been developed by the agency. So there will be attempts to overturn it. I don't think they'll be successful. It will be a lot of drama, but I don't think it's going to, at least under the current political circumstances and structural circumstances here in Washington, I don't think that's going to be the case. But I think more and more people are understanding this. The polls, as Senator Whitehouse mentions, are something like 70% in favor of this plan. Very few people are opposed to it, and I think people understand, the people of America understand this issue. And they understand what's going on. Thank you.
We can turn to Senator Carter.
First, I want to thank Tony Owen for coming. He and I have known each other for some 40 years. Neither one of us have aged much, I think. I want to thank Tony for coming up and thank all of you, because it's your testimony from the field that I think really makes the difference. Couple of things. If there's one thing Congress does really well, it's avoid issues. That may be our highest skill, and we avoid doing budgets, we avoid funding highways, and we avoid dealing with climate change. This is a case where, in a sense, the inertia of Congress is in our favor because the Clean Power Plan is out there. And as I mentioned, I think it's going to be difficult to stop it, but that's why it's so important. Two other just very quick things. I do have a pocket full of these cards that I mentioned, and anybody that would like to take one, they're going to be here. I find them very interesting to hand out to my colleagues. Some of them say, oh, that's interesting, and others say, and put it in a pocket. I won't identify who's who. And then finally, some of you may have seen me take out my phone, and I wasn't checking my texts. As I was listening to all of you talk and the comments that you were making, it occurs to me that the solution to this problem has to be in part governmental, but it really has to be individual. And it has to be people making individual decisions all over the world, not just in the United States, but all over the world. And what I was looking up was Robert Kennedy's famous speech in South Africa in June of 1966, where I think he captured this idea of what individual people can do better than I've ever seen it captured. I remember it at the time. He said, each time a man or woman stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, they send forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. And it's the individual ripples of hope that have to emanate from everyone in this room and millions of people across the world, and that's how we're going to solve this problem. Thank you, Sheldon.